Welcome to Ignatius Press Off the Shelf with Vivian Dudro, myself, Father Fessio, and Joseph Pearce. We are discussing J.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man. We almost finished chapter 6 of the Gods and the Demons, the War of the Gods and the Demons. Vivian will summarize, read a summarizing quote in comment.
Right. And just it's chapter 7, the War of the Gods and the Demons, and I'm on page 150. And we left off with Joseph reading Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? The great Carthaginian general and military genius. For who would have ever thought the Carthaginians who were on the Mediterranean would cross into Italy by going through the Alps from the north to the south? I mean, it was like crazy with elephants and everything, right? So it looked, and by the way, as he swept through, the local people were starting to, see which way the wind was going to blow, and they started fighting for the Carthaginians as well. I mean, it really looked like Rome was going to be lost, and it wasn't. And so Chesterton on page 150, he says, "It is not for us to guess in what manner or moment the mercy of God might in any case have rescued the world, but it is certain that the struggle which established Christendom would have been very different if there had been an empire of Carthage instead of an empire of Rome. We have to thank the patience of the Punic Wars if, in after ages, divine things descended at least upon human things and not inhuman." So Chesterton, for one, is grateful that Rome won the Punic Wars, because it would have been a different civilization entirely that would have been in place when Christ was born, if he'd been born at the time that he was.
Yes.
Yeah, but I do love that question there. If we just can add a little bit there, 'cause I think it's very quaint. Immediately below where you've just read, Vivian, can any man in his senses compare the great wooden doll whom the children expected to eat a little bit of the dinner with the great idol who would have been expected to eat the children?
Yes. That wicked sense of humor. Yes, and then so this he's setting up that even though Rome won against Carthage, and we should all be grateful for that, the fact is that Rome itself falls. And, he says over and over again in the next chapter, man could do no more.
Right. That's what he does is he shows the inner drama of history leading up to Christianity, but he makes it plausible by picking out these things which have happened and show this is what happened. He says, we had this paganism had many things were honorable, but then it began to degrade within, and we had the big battle between Carthage, excuse me, Carthaginian paganism and Roman paganism, and thank God Rome won, because now we have a world in which at least we have human things to descend upon rather than inhuman. But now comes the climax of this part of the book, chapter 8, the end of the world. What happens with the greatest thing that man has produced? It's like a wave at its peak that's going to collapse. That's his image. So let's go on to chapter 8, the end of the world. What does that title mean? Well, for us whose traditions come from the Mediterranean, I mean, he's not talking about China or the Aztecs or the Mayans, but for Western civilization, Rome was the world. I mean, the empire, included everybody now. And what happened to it? Page 153 at the top.
Yes.
It was the best sort of paganism that wore the laurels of Rome. It was the best thing the world had yet seen, all things considered, on any large scale, that ruled the wall from the wall of the Grampians, which is in Great Britain, to the Garden of the Euphrates. It was the best that conquered. It was the best that ruled. It was the best that began to decay.
Very good.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And so down at the bottom of that page, he starts by kind of tracing even with the Greeks, which is where Rome got its mythology and gods. Just as they became, this is the very last lines, just as they became unnatural by worshiping nature, So they actually became unmanly by worshiping man.
Yeah, yeah. Just above that as well, if I can, just in the middle of that page there. So I love this. Chesterton setting a question again. But Carthage at any rate was dead, and the worst assault ever made by the demons on mortal society had been defeated. That's the good news. But then the question: but how much would it matter that the worst was dead if the best was dying?
Yeah.
So that's basically what that question sets up the whole of this chapter and his discussion of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And how does it die? Well, as we talked about the previous chapter, the uh decadence and debauchery is what eats away a society from within.
And then he really gives a very important place, as I think it's due, to Virgil as the poet who most expresses the Roman charism or the Roman idea, so to speak. And he talks about Virgil as a poet of the autumn, and the eclogues. You read those things, and it's about the bees buzzing and the leaves turning great and the grapes being harvested. It's sort of the end of the cycle.
Mm.
And then he says at the bottom of page 155, the demons were driven in flight before the household gods, but there are two particular points about him, Virgil, and his work, which are particularly important to the main thesis here. The first is that the whole of his great patriotic epic, in a very specific, peculiar sense, is founded upon the fall of Troy. And we see that the idea of the glory of the defeated warrior Hector, uh, and what Rome comes not from the victor, but from the defeated. And again, Chesterton sees in that this foreshadowing of salvation through the crucified.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing
Mm-hmm.
here, though, is I mean, there's the wonderful paradox here because, of course, on a purely sort of worldly level, you can see why the Romans had fought the Greeks, right? So the Greeks were the enemy, and the Romans were the new civilization. The Greeks were the old civilization. So one-upmanship. You can understand all of that, but the real irony is, of course, that the paradox of the conquered being the conqueror, right? Because it's the Greek gods that the Romans adopt. It's the Greek epics, the Homer's epics. Without Homer's epic of the fall of Troy, there would be no Aeneid. And so, although Rome imagines that it arose from the ashes of the city which was defeated by the Greeks, nonetheless, culturally speaking, the vanquishers were vanquished. I mean, they became Greek.
Yes, yes, yes. And when Jesus comes into the world, Greek is mostly the lingua franca, and that's the language educated people read and write. So it lasted for some time, this Greco culture as being at the heart of Roman culture.
Yeah.
And on page 156, at the bottom, the other element in Virgil, which is essential to the argument, is the particular nature of his relation to mythology, which is pastoral poetry, he says here. The idea of the beauty of the country, the simple, the getting close to the soil, and the promise of the city, which I'm sure is a theme that you love, Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, well, at bottom of page 157, well, the ancient instinct and humor of humanity have always told them, under whatever conventions, that the conventions of complex cities were less really healthy and happy than the customs of the countryside. So it is the eternity of the egglogs, and then a couple of lines. But nobody has yet written anything called Wall Street egglogs, in which millionaires should take the place of the poets. And the reason is that there is a real, if only a recurrent yearning for that sort of simplicity, and there is never that sort of yearning for that sort of complexity.
Right, but hidden here, it's often the decadent society that yearns for this return to the simplicity of the countryside. So, for example, at Versailles, you have Marie Antoinette having built for her an entire shepherdess pastoral scene with cottages and costumes and sheep so that she could go play shepherdess, in the gardens of Versailles, right? So the most decadent, corrupt monarchy imaginable, and the queen is prancing around in the garden dressed as a shepherdess, right? Looking for simplicity and naturalness and
I mean, the hippies, peace man.
yeah,
We got to get back to the garden, right? And we have to wonder to what extent, that this is a yearning. And we're in a land of exile. We're exiled from the garden, right? So there's something within us which yearns for that simplicity, which we've lost through the complexity of sin.
yes, yes. But it is actually a sign of decadence when this yearning reemerges in this sentimental way. It's actually a sign of the outer decay that's going on that people
Well,
now
it is in her case. I don't necessarily think that all pastoral poetry and pastoral paintings are an expression of decadence.
no, I'm saying that the not that the decadence I'm saying that the decadent society around you is what produces in you a yearning for these things. It's a reaction to that. It's a wanting, like you just said, it's a wanting to get back to how did we get here? Can't we go back? Can't we go back to something more simple and natural and holistic and balanced? And so that occurs in the death rattle of these other societies.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to
Hmm.
say.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't produce it in the sense of creating out of nothing, but there is that desire in the human heart for that kind of simplicity, but it gets overlaid with complexity, and then the complexity becomes uh, unsatisfying, and therefore that brings forth,
Yes.
anew, if you will, the
Yes.
desire which was there.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think
but
I think
unfortunately, it often emerges in a sentimental
Yeah,
way,
of course,
you
that
know
does have it happens now.
yeah,
Yes.
the complexity also leads to accretions which are increasingly artificial, and I
Yes.
think I think this artificiality which ultimately we rebel against. I want to get back to something that's more real, and then you that means getting back to primal things like growing food, right?
Right. So think about this example of Marie Antoinette. What are they wearing in court? They're wearing these massive phony wigs, these massive dresses, layers and layers of makeup, the men too, satin shoes. And what does she want to do? She wants to go take all this off and go out in the garden with a bunch of sheep and a shepherdess crook. You know what I mean? So there is this, how do I escape from this yeah, but we laugh because anyway, it's laughable too. All right.
So, now to relate that now to this very movement happening with mythology, page 158, about, I don't know, 12, 14 lines up, third of the way up page. Only as the whole society grew in age and experience, there began to appear that weakness in all mythology, already noted in the chapter under that name. This religion was not quite a religion. In other words, this religion was not quite a reality. That's the thing. It's like Santa Claus. You've got these gods and stuff like that, but you can't really put an intellectual trust in them, and you become less influential in your life, I guess.
Yeah, you can't. There's nothing you ever get. That I can think of when you read the Greek myths, um, of someone whose desires to change their life in order to emulate the gods. I mean, it's not. I need to have a conversion so that I can sort of be more like Apollo. I mean, you don't see that. It's as if there's this real distance between that which is being painted, the imaginative pantheon, and real life, right? You're not really going to want to be like Apollo because he's A, not real, and B, too far away.
Anybody with something on 160 or before?
I've got something on page 159, which does play into what Vivian just said about Marie Antoinette. So just under halfway down, um, the effect of this staleness is the same everywhere. It is seen in all drug taking and dram drinking and every form of the tendency to increase the dose.
Mhm.
Men seek stranger sins or more startling obscenities as stimulants to their jaded sense. They seek after mad oriental religions for the same reason. They try to stab their nerves to life, if it were with the knives of the priests of Baal. They're walking in their sleep and trying to wake themselves up with nightmares. There's a wonderful book, I'm not necessarily recommending it, called Arabur by Joris Cole Huysmans, where basically the character at the beginning, stinking rich, no connections. So he's not got anybody to worry about, and he can do what he likes because he's wealthy enough. And that's what he does. He indulges every single sensual desire, every single sensual passion throughout the whole novel, getting more and more perverse. And at one point, he goes to a dentist to have a tooth removed, even though there's nothing wrong with his tooth, because he wants to experience the excruciating pain. So the point is, he gets more and more perverse because the ordinary sensual pleasures are no longer satisfying. And then the final page of the novel, there's a cri de coeur, a cry from the heart to a God that he doesn't even know exists, for help. So this whole idea that if we could do exactly what we liked and indulge all of our sensual appetites, we would be happy, is an illusion and a delusion. And I think that's, again, not knowing what Chesterton's saying here. This is what's happening at the end of the Roman Empire, right? Where all this decadence is not bringing any satisfaction, any sense of fulfillment. Something else is needed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And he notes, which again resonates with the French example I just gave, he notes too on the bottom of 159, the empire at the end was organized more and more on that servile system, which generally goes with the boast of organization. Indeed, it was almost as servile as the modern schemes for the organization of industry. It is proverbial that what would once have been a peasantry became a mere populace of the town dependent for bread and circuses, which may again suggest to some a mob dependent on doles and cinemas. Uh, in this, as in many other respects, the modern return to heathenism has been a return not even to the heathen youth, but rather to heathen old age. So, he's making connection between the slavery system that all of Rome's wealth was built on. And, by late 1700s France, the peasantry were completely overworked and depleted, exhausted, and starving. And the whole system was based on their backs. And now he's comparing it to modern industrialization and, the factory workers, everything. So it is interesting that at this late stage, if you want to call it, of an empire, we have this huge disparity of wealth. We have the wealthy becoming ridiculously decadent, and we have the poor just completely brutalized underneath
Bella called
Yeah.
it wage slavery.
in the modern era.
In the
Yeah.
modern
Wage slavery, or the decay of the peasantry into a proletariat, right? That have no property, they have no land, they're completely dependent as far as they're wage slaves. That's basically where this complexity can and often does lead.
So he talks on page 160 and following the society getting weary of these gods, and also of the philosophy. The bottom of the page, they began to betray to the world the fact they're walking in a circle and saying the same thing over and over again. Philosophy began to be a joke. It also began to be a bore, and so on. Everything was virtue, everything was happiness, everything was fate, everything was good, everything was bad. Anyhow, everything was everything. And there's no more to be said, so they said it.
Well, it's also been remarked, kind of like this urge to get back to the pastoral, bucolic simplicity. There's also at the end of empires also a great deal of discussion about virtue. In other words, things that should just be a matter of sense that, but no, people are talking about it, people are writing about it, people are calling for it. That's actually a sign that it's missing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's see here.
Follow page 161 if you're moving on. Just
Okay.
those two sentences at the end of that full paragraph there. A dreadful secret seemed to be written as in obscure hieroglyphics across those mighty works of marble and stone, those colossal amphitheaters and aqueducts. Man could do no more.
Yep.
It continued until the end of the paragraph.
That is the end of the paragraph.
No,
You want me to read the
paragraph,
next one?
maybe.
Yeah. For it was not the message blazed on the Babylonian wall that one king was found wanting or his one kingdom given to a stranger. It was no such good news as the news of invasion and conquest.
Now, notice that
There,
irony. Why would you call invasion and conquest good news? He explains. Continue.
there was nothing left that could conquer Rome, but there was also nothing left that could improve it. It was the strongest thing that was growing weak. It was the best thing that was going to the bad. It is necessary to insist again and again that many civilizations had met in one civilization of the Mediterranean Sea, that it was already universal with a stale and sterile universality. The peoples had pooled their resources and still there was not enough. The empires had gone into partnership and they were still bankrupt. No philosopher who was really philosophical could think anything except that in that central sea, the wave of the world has risen to its highest, seeming to touch the stars, but the wave was already stooping, for it was only the wave of the world.
Only the wave of the world. That's a beautiful image he's got there.
Mm-hmm.
And what would I like to conclude with? I have it for 163. You know, this is the end of part one. It's a setting up of the coming of Christ, which will be in part two. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to propose, if it's okay with you, that Joseph reads from the middle of page 163 to the end of the chapter, because this is just his own summation of what's happened.
Sure.
Okay?
Fine with me.
All right.
The life of the great civilization went on with dreary industry and even with dreary festivity. It was the end of the world, and the worst of it was that it need never end. A convenient compromise had been made between all the multitudinous myths and religions of the empire, that each group should worship freely and merely give a sort of official flourish of thanks to the tolerant emperor by tossing a little incense to him under his official title of Divus. Naturally, there was no difficulty about that, or rather, it was a long time before the world realized that there ever had it been even a trivial difficulty anywhere. The members of some Eastern sect or secret society or other seemed to have made a scene somewhere. Nobody could imagine why. The incident occurred once or twice again and began to arouse irritation out of proportion to its insignificance. It was not exactly what these provincials said, though of course it sounded queer enough. They seemed to be saying that God was dead and that they themselves had seen him die. This might be one of the many manias produced by the despair of the age, only they did not seem particularly despairing. They seemed quite unnaturally joyful about it, and gave the reason that the death of God had allowed them to eat him and drink his blood. According to other accounts, God was not exactly dead after all. There trailed through the bewildered imagination some sort of fantastic procession of the funeral of God, at which the sun turned black, but which ended with the dead omnipotence breaking out of the tomb and rising again like the sun. But it was not the strange story to which anybody paid any particular attention. People in that world had seen queer religions enough to fill a madhouse. It was something in the tone of the madmen and their type of formation. They were a scratch company of barbarians and slaves and poor and unimportant people, but their formation was military. They moved together and were very absolute about who and what was really a part of their little system, and about what they said, however mildly, there was a ring like iron. Men used to many mythologies and moralities could make no analysis of the mystery, except the curious conjecture that they meant what they said. All attempts to make them see reason in the perfectly simple matter of the emperor's statue seemed to be spoken to deaf men. It was as if a new meteoric metal had fallen on the earth. It was a difference of substance to the touch. Those who touched their foundation fancied they had struck a rock. With a strange rapidity, like the changes of a dream, the proportions of things seemed to change in their presence. Before most men knew what had happened, these few men were palpably present. They were important enough to be ignored. People became suddenly silent about them and walked stiffly past them. We see a new scene in which the world has drawn its skirts away from these men and women, and they stand in the center of a great space like lepers. The scene changes again, and the great space where they stand is overhung on every side with a cloud of witnesses, interminable terraces full of faces looking down towards them intently, for strange things are happening to them. New tortures have been invented for the madmen who have brought good news. That sad and weary society seems almost to find a new energy in establishing its first religious persecution. Nobody yet knows very clearly why that level world has thus lost its balance about the people in its midst, but they stand unnaturally still while the arena and the world seem to revolve round them. And there shone on them in that dark hour a light that has never been darkened, a white fire clinging to that group like an unearthly phosphorescence, blazing its track through the twilight of history and confounding every effort to confound it with the mists of mythology and theory. That shaft of light or lightning by which the world itself has struck and isolated and crowned it, by which its own enemies have made it more illustrious and its own critics have made it more inexplicable. The halo of hatred around the Church of God. That's
That's
marvelous.
such a beautiful presentation of what it was like at the time, because Chesterton puts himself inside the Romans. What are they seeing? This little sect, the queer religion. They're growing. What are they saying? And it leads to the Colosseum and the martyrs. Yeah. Anything?
That's just at his
That's,
best. I mean,
that's a
just
great
a
way to
pure
conclude. So
prose style.
we'll begin next session with the second part of the book, part 2 on the man called Christ. God bless you.